Hello everyone, I'm Tad Scritchfield and I will be presenting on focus areas 1 and 3. I will be concentrating on the classical style and opera buffa, including a few composers from each. I will be following the book pretty closely, so you can follow along from pages 314 to 321, or just open my Word document I attached to my email and follow that. So let's jump right in and start talking about the classical style. But first I want to make a point that the classical style is very important, and it would be a really good idea to know everything you can about it. So, Hanning 2010 says, quote, "Known at the time as the galant style, its values became the foundation for the musical idiom of the mid to late 18th century that we call the classical style." End quote. There were a lot of new characteristics in the classical style, and most of the Baroque features were changed. Now let's begin talking about these new characteristics of the classical style. First characteristic I want to talk about is the melody. The Music Learning Center 2012 tells us that, quote, "Classical melodies are among the most tuneful and easiest to remember. The themes of even highly sophisticated compositions may have a folk or popular flavor. Occasionally, composers simply borrowed popular tunes, Mozart borrowing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. More often, however, they wrote original themes with a popular character." End quote. Composers use sequential repetition as their prime platform for composing. Now we'll move on to periodicity. Periodicity is defined by Dictionary.com 2012 as, quote, "the character of being periodic, the tendency to recur at regular intervals." End quote. In music, to split up the melody into sections relatable to each other through the melody, periodicity was used to embody the piece with breakpoints. Sporadic cadences indicating the varying phrase structure. Anywhere from 2 to 6 measures long, musical ideas were expressed by definite phrases, and each phrase was subjective to strong and weak cadences. These phrases were combined to make periods, which in turn made the music more structured, and songs now had more of a definite beginning, middle, and end. Heinrich Christoph Koch's treatise Versuch einer Anleitung zur Komposition focused on demonstrating that grammatically firm sentences were comparable to melodies, and that was called rhetoricism. Christenen 2002 describes, quote, Koch proceeded to describe various types of musical phrases in consuming detail, attending closely to the relations of cadential articulation and melodic behavior. Reinforcing the melody structure of phrases and periods is the harmony. Classical music was homophonic with the melody in the highest voice. The Alberti bass was one of the most commonly used harmonization techniques. It was characterized by chords that were broken or arpeggiated, creating an underlying, supporting, and rousing flurry of an understated background. The Alberti bass was invented by the Venetian composer Domenico Alberti. Although Alberti only lived for about 30 years, he made quite an impact with his musical talent. He lived in Rome, making his living as a singer, composer, and teacher, all the while studying under Antonio Lotti. A lot of his pieces feature the Alberti bass, obviously, and there are many examples to listen to, but sadly, none of his pieces are featured in the Norton Anthology. So, I just chose the example that is in the book. 8 Sonnet per Cembalo, Option 1, Sonata 3. So go ahead and jump out there that first listening example and listen to that for about 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Now moving on to opera buffa. It was one of the most popular genres in classical music during the early 1700s. Opera buffa was an Italian comic opera, making its appearance in the early 18th century. Emotions were greater conveyed through a wide range of characters, each with their own quirks and faults, giving the opera moral depth. A smaller version of comic opera was called an intermezzo. Thulin 1991 explains, quote, "This was a short piece, usually only one act long, which was produced between the acts of a longer, more serious opera. Later, toward the turn of the century, these pieces grew to be of a larger size and greater importance, and they were eventually performed as opera in their own right, no longer intermixed with the serious opera." End quote. Giovanni Battista Pergolesi wrote one of the most praised intermezzo, La Serva Padrona. He was born in Naples in 1710 and lived a very short life of only 26 years. He spent most of his life with the Conservatorio di Poveri di Gesù Cristo under Gaetano Greco, Leonardo Vinci, and Francisco Durante. He wrote La Serva Padrona as an intermezzo for his opera Il Pergolesi Superbo, after being commissioned to write an opera for the Empress's birthday. His fame grew more after he died in 1736, when his comedies were published and they started being performed more widely. So you can go out and go to the second YouTube link and listen to that for about 2 minutes and 30 seconds also. This next composer isn't mentioned in the book, but I found him to be pretty interesting. Gioacchino Antonio Rossini wrote many successful operas, including his piece La Scala di Seta. In his operas, he embellished his melodies, which was an uncommon thing to do in classical music at that time. So, go to the last YouTube link that I have, and that one's really long. It's like an hour and a half long, or almost 2 hours long. And so start at 1 hour and 32 minutes and listen to it for about 3 minutes. So soon opera buffa spread to other countries, adapting to each of the country's own unique styles, yet still keeping the main element of opera buffa. In France, comic operas were known as opera comique, and often used spoken word instead of a recitative. English opera buffa was called a ballad opera. The German form of opera buffa was named Singspiel, taking its foundation from England's operas and then France operas. So classical music has a really big part in history, contributing to some of today's music. I'm really excited for what these next couple chapters hold in our book, and I hope to enjoy learning whatever information is there. I made a quiz for you guys to challenge yourselves on the information you just heard from me. So you can go out to that last link in my email and take that quiz, and then I'll email the scores to you a little bit later in the week. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and I'll see y'all later.